Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Along the street of a small provincial town, a little girl walked sadly. She appeared to be 5 or 6 years old, although in reality, she was almost 8. It was due to her unusual thinness and short height. Her clothes, which clearly didn't fit her, added to the impression as they hung on her like a sack. Her name was Rosa. One might think she was an orphan, but that would be untrue. It was just that a misfortune had befallen her family. She lived with her mother, who had to juggle between work and raising the child. To somehow provide food and clothing for both herself and Rosa, she stood at the outdoor market all day, selling various goods. They paid her hourly, so she worked without weekends and in any weather, rain, which the tattered canopy couldn't fully protect her from, and bone-chilling winds. It was not surprising to fall ill with such work, but she wasn't officially employed, so no one would pay for her sick leave. Thus, she stood behind the counter, already suffering from a bad cold, until things took a turn for the worse. At the clinic, they said she had pneumonia and needed to be hospitalized. But who will I leave my daughter with? No, I can't go to the hospital, she pleaded. Well, I can't force you, sighed the doctor. But, at the very least, strict bed rest is advised, and here's a list of medications you need to take. The list turned out to be extensive, and she simply couldn't afford to buy most of the prescribed medicines. She couldn't rely on any assistance. Her unfortunate parents had passed away many years ago due to alcoholism, and she had no husband, nor had she ever had one. Rosa's father had abandoned her mother as soon as he found out she was pregnant. So, she had to do everything herself. Her daughter tried to help as much as she could, applying compresses and buying the medicines that were affordable from the list. However, those turned out to be only supportive remedies and had no effect. The fever kept rising, and they couldn't bring it down. At times, the mother started to enter a semi-delirious state. First, Rosa hoped that her mother would get better over time. It's usually like that with a cold. At first, everything gets worse and worse, but then you reach a certain point and gradually start recovering. But, as it turned out, this was not the case. The illness had progressed to a severe form that couldn't pass on its own. And so, Rosa walked down the street, not really understanding why. Maybe she hoped to get some food, even just a little bit, ideally, chicken. She had heard that chicken broth helps with a cold. Of course, it wouldn't replace expensive medicines, but maybe it could at least alleviate her mother's condition a little. As for obtaining the medications themselves, the girl couldn't dare to hope. You can't just go to the pharmacy and say that your mother is dying and you don't have money for medicines. That image stood before her eyes. She stood in front of the pharmacy counter and with a tearful voice pleaded, "Sonora, give me these medications, and I will bring you the money later when my mother recovers and is able to earn them." Having imagined Sonora's reaction to such a statement, Rosa chuckled unhappily. It occurred to her that she could try to earn some money herself. But how, she had no idea. After all, nobody hires children, especially ones as young as her. Well, stealing was definitely out of the question. Her thoughts were interrupted by a strange gleam that caught her attention in the nearest trash bin. Approaching closer, she realized that the gleam was coming from a bank card lying on top of all the garbage. Rosa retrieved it and examined it closely. Attached to the card was a small piece of paper with 4 neatly written numbers. It must be the PIN code. Rosa's mom also had a bank card, although it hardly ever had any money on it. Sometimes her mom would send her with the card to buy groceries or withdraw a little cash from the nearest ATM. So the girl knew very well how to handle such things. Well, if it's lying in the trash, Rosa said to herself, then it must have been thrown away. And if it's thrown away, it's unlikely that anyone needs it. With that in mind, she headed towards the nearest ATM, not holding much hope that there would be any money on the card. Like, who would throw away a card with money on it? Well, if there happened to be any, it would come in handy. She could buy medicine for her mom or at least some chicken for soup. Of course, doubts crept into her mind about the rightness of her actions. What if the card ended up in the trash by mistake? On the other hand, if someone could accidentally throw away money, it meant they didn't need it as much as she did. And her situation was desperate. If her mom didn't receive help soon, she might even die. With this thought, tears welled up in Rosa's eyes, and she quickened her pace. Upon reaching the ATM, the girl first checked the card's balance. When she saw the amount displayed on the screen, her eyes widened in astonishment. Until that moment, she couldn't even imagine that one person could have so much money. By her calculations, the sum she saw would be enough for her and her mom for almost a lifetime. All her doubts disappeared right away. A person with such wealth wouldn't suffer much from her taking a little money for her mom's medicine. Rosa had no intention of withdrawing a large sum of money. As she left the bank branch, she immediately headed to the nearest pharmacy. She bought all the necessary medications for her mom. Her estimation was spot on, as there was barely any money left. Rosa, whose thoughts were still occupied by the healing chicken soup, decided to go to the grocery store and see if she could buy something with the rest of money. On her way out of the pharmacy, she bumped into a woman who, although not young, looked quite well off. The woman looked at her attentively with an expression that Rosa couldn't quite understand, and then unexpectedly asked, "Little girl, did you withdraw money from the ATM nearby?" Rosa felt a tremor. She understood. This woman was the owner of the card. And now, most likely, they would accuse her of theft, drag her to the police, and the girl wouldn't have time to bring medicine to her mother. Her eyes filled with tears once again. "I took it," she confessed honestly. "But I found this card in the trash, so I thought nobody needed it anymore. You have to understand me, we really need the money. My mother is sick, and we have no way to buy her medicine." Well. Calm down, the woman said gently. "I know you didn't steal anything. It was my cleaner who accidentally threw away the card. We have an office nearby, and that's how it ended up in the trash. Besides, I know how much money was on the card, and you took just a little. And you didn't take it for yourself, but to help someone close to you." Rosa couldn't calm down. She kept apologizing incoherently and mumbling about her mother's illness. She showed the bag of medicine and the receipt as proof that she had spent the money exactly as she said. Finally, after a few minutes, she managed to quell the stream of tears. "What's your name?" the woman asked. "Rosa," the girl almost whispered. "I'm Sabina, nice to meet you. You know, Rosa, let's go and buy some more vitamins and some groceries for your mom to make her feel better. Consider it a reward for your discovery." And together, they bought vitamins and went to the grocery store. The woman filled an entire basket, fruits, vegetables, milk, and to Rosa's delight, a much-desired chicken. Now she would definitely be able to make a great broth for her mom. At 7 years old, she was already quite skilled in cooking. Sabina helped Rosa carry the groceries home. She didn't come inside, leaving everything in the hallway. The girl invited her rescuer to come in, at least for a cup of coffee, but she politely declined. "I recently had a cold," she explained, "so it's better for me not to be around sick people right now. Besides, your mom clearly has more important things to think about. Here, take my phone number just in case." Thanking the woman for her kindness, Rosa gave her mother a dose of medicine and began preparing the broth. Her mother's condition worried her greatly. The state of semi-delirium seemed almost constant. The girl feared that help might arrive too late. 2 days passed. The woman's condition only worsened. Rosa couldn't feed her or even get her to take the medicine. In the end, she completely lost touch with reality, and Rosa made up her mind to call an ambulance. Mom was taken to the hospital, refusing to let the girl in with her despite all the pleading. Not knowing what to do next, the girl dialed Sabina's number and explained the situation with a trembling voice. "Sorry for bothering you. Mom got worse, they took her to the hospital, and they won't let me in. I don't even know what to do. I'm sorry, I just don't have anyone else to turn to," the girl explained. "Don't worry, Rosa," Sabina replied gently. "I'll come to you right away, and we'll figure everything out." And indeed, she arrived in just half an hour. I've been thinking, Rosa, she began, almost from the doorstep. If you want, you can stay with us for now. We have plenty of space in the house, and my husband won't object. Did the doctors tell you which hospital they took your mom to, at least? Rosa simply nodded, unable to speak a word. All right, I'll go there for now, talk to the doctors. Maybe there's something else we can do to help her. Don't worry, everything will be fine. Rosa agreed to stay with Sabina, and without wasting any time, they headed to her home. As it turned out, not far from their neighborhood, with its dreary identical 5-story buildings, there was a completely different world. They arrived in a private sector where several streets were filled with luxurious mansions. And it was in one of these mansions that Rosa's savior lived. Entrusting the girl to the care of her husband, who happened to have a day off, Sabina went straight to the hospital to see Rosa's mother. Upon arriving at the clinic, she first went to the reception area. Hello, she said. A couple of hours ago, Ida Vargas was supposed to be brought here. And who are you to her? Lazily inquired the young girl sitting at the registration desk. Her mother, Sabina lied without batting an eye. If there was one thing she had learned in her 50-plus years of life, it was that no one in the hospital would talk to someone completely unrelated to the patient. But they also wouldn't go out of their way to verify the degree of kinship stated. The girl at the desk started typing something on her computer keyboard. Then she looked up at Sabina. She's in critical condition. Visits are currently not allowed. Can I speak to her attending physician? Of course. Second floor, 23rd office. You're in luck, it's visiting hours now. Entering the designated office, Sabina had a conversation with the doctor. The conversation was fairly short and strictly business-oriented. Indicating that she had sufficient funds, Sabina requested to have Ida transferred to a separate room. Furthermore, she expressed her willingness to spare no expense on medications and treatment methods. I will cover everything that is not covered by free healthcare, she said. Regardless of the amount. Just do what is necessary and send me the bill. That was all she could do for the sick woman at the moment. Therefore, considering her mission accomplished, she went home. She was confident in her husband, of course, but still wanted to personally ensure of how the girl was doing. After all, she needed the care and support that only a woman could provide. Ideally, a mother, of course. But she didn't have the luxury of choosing in this situation. She found Rosa in a rather depressed state. The luxurious surroundings of the house she ended up in didn't impress her. Even the fact that she was allocated a separate room, something many children from less affluent families dream of, couldn't lift her spirits. She sat on the bed, dangling one leg and nervously twitching it. As soon as Sabina entered the room, the girl immediately moved towards her. What? What about Mom? She asked with difficulty. The doctors are currently taking care of her treatment. Your mom is going through a difficult time, as you've seen. But her life is not in danger. That was partly a lie. With such advanced pneumonia, there can be no certainty that the body will be able to cope with the illness, even with proper treatment. But she couldn't tell a 7-year-old child that her beloved mother was on the brink of life and death, ready to cross it at any moment. 3 days passed in tense anticipation. Although Rosa believed the woman's words, she still couldn't find peace from anxiety. In the end, the hospital informed them that the crisis had passed and there was no longer any threat to the patient's life. Of course, there would still be a long course of treatment ahead, but it could now be confidently stated that it would be successful. Thanks to Sabina's efforts, Rosa's mother recovered quite quickly. Within a few days, her condition improved to such an extent that Sabina was allowed to visit her. Rosa also wanted to go, but the woman convinced her that it would be better if she waited for her mother's full recovery. In reality, she wasn't sure if their conversation was suitable for a young child to hear. Ida, hello. My name is Sabina, and, strange as it may sound, I want to warn you right away that to the hospital staff, I am your mother. I had to resort to this trick, otherwise, no one would talk to me. So, you paid for my treatment? Responded Ida. I'm very grateful to you, but honestly, I don't quite understand. You shouldn't thank me, Sabina smiled, but your wonderful daughter. She's really concerned about you. Don't worry, she's staying with me now, and she's doing fine. And the woman briefly told the story of how she met Rosa thanks to a lost bank card. I don't even know how to thank you for everything, Ida muttered. I have nothing to offer you, and the money you spent on me, it seems I won't be able to repay in a lifetime. I have more than enough money, Sabina replied. And you and Rosa somehow appealed to me, that's why I wanted to help you. Not only out of pity, although that's certainly part of it. Here's what, tell me how you ended up in such an unpleasant situation, and we'll try to figure out how to prevent it from happening again. The best gratitude for me would be if you and your daughter are in a warm, well-fed, and safe environment. How did I end up here? It's a typical story, Ida sighed. Instead of studying properly and getting a profession, I fell in love with Rosa's father. It was right after school. I didn't go to university. I thought, well, it's not a big deal, I'll get a job next year. Then I got pregnant, and the guy immediately left me. He said he wasn't ready for such responsibility and all that. I didn't have time to study. I had to work to support Rosa and myself. And my parents didn't help either. They just drank endlessly and then both died. And at the market where I work, the conditions are bad, so I got sick. That's the thing, Sabina said, attentively listening to her story. Quit your market trading before it completely ruins you. Just recently, my housekeeper resigned, and I'm looking for a replacement for her. Move in with me along with your daughter. There are plenty of vacant rooms in the house. The salary will be decent. We'll enroll Rosa in a good school, and you won't need anything. And if anything happens, I'll cover your sick leave as well. Ida couldn't believe her luck. At a moment when it seemed all hope was lost, this woman appeared and offered to solve all the remaining problems at once. Of course, she couldn't refuse such a tempting offer. Ida expressed her gratitude to Sabina at length, while Sabina just chuckled. And they bid farewell. A few days later, Rosa finally convinced Sabina to take her to visit her mother. Both of them were incredibly happy to see each other, and it seemed that now they were finally completely at ease and stopped worrying about each other. Giving the mother and daughter some time to talk privately, Sabina then took the girl back home. Truth be told, they didn't receive a warm welcome there. Right at the doorstep stood Diana, Sabina's daughter, who had unexpectedly shown up at home for the first time during that period. Neither her mother nor her father knew where she had been. When asked any questions, she responded that she was an adult now and didn't owe anyone an explanation. Which was true after all, she had turned 25 this year. Nevertheless, her parents were very worried that she might get involved with the wrong crowd, as there were some indications of such behavior. However, they couldn't do anything about it, and usually saw Diana only when she ran out of money and came home to demand more. And now she stood at the doorstep, expressing her discontent with her entire appearance. It seemed that her dissatisfaction was directed specifically at her mother. And when the girl spoke, it became clear that it was indeed the case. What kind of charity work are you doing here? Diana began, indignant, without even bothering to greet. You're spending our family's money on some vagabonds. You're bringing just anyone into the house. What are you even thinking? And what if this girl robs us? Hello, Diana. I'm very glad to see you, Sabina replied. I kindly ask you not to make a scene in front of the child. Let me take the girl to her room, and then we can discuss everything, all right? No. So, the girl already has her own room here? How surprising. What's next? Are you going to bring her mother here too? This is supposed to be our family home, not a shelter for the homeless. Diana, I've asked you. The woman's tone became colder. Please, let us inside. This house is still under my ownership, and I have the right to do what I consider necessary. With these words, she led Rosa past the enraged girl, escorted her upstairs, and asked her not to leave the room for the next hour. The girl could hear the argument downstairs and understood that she was the cause of it. But within a few minutes, everything quieted down. Then footsteps could be heard on the stairs, followed by a knock on the door. "Come in," Rosa timidly said, unaccustomed to such delicacy. It was Diana. "I would like to apologize for what I said downstairs," she reluctantly spoke. "It was very rude of me. I don't mind if you and Mom stay with us for some time." Her tone, and even little Rosa understood it, spoke quite the opposite. After recovering, Ida moved to live with her savior. Rosa was thrilled to learn that they would now stay in this house permanently. She had already grown accustomed to the surrounding luxury and the company of the homeowners. Furthermore, as promised, Sabina enrolled her in a new school, an elite gymnasium. Fortunately, the girl's abilities were more than enough to pass the preliminary test. Sabina's husband, Antonio, turned out to be a very pleasant person, calm, well-read, and highly intelligent. It was easy for Ida to find a common language with him, just like with his wife. Occasionally, the three of them would engage in leisurely conversations over an evening cup of coffee. Ida diligently fulfilled her duties, to the extent that the homeowner had to remind her from time to time that overworking oneself is harmful to one's health. "Ida, put down the cloth. There's no dust left on this shelf," she would say. "And, in general, you remember that you have a regulated workday that ended 2 hours ago. I hired you as a maid, not as a slave. Let's go have some coffee instead." Rosa is eager to tell her mom what she learned today at school. Overall, things were going well for them, except for one annoying detail, Diana. The girl was Ida's peer, but behaved as if she were still 16. She didn't study anywhere or work, she only spent her parents' money in restaurants and upscale boutiques. Her father and mother, of course, were disappointed, but they couldn't deny anything to their beloved daughter. Although Sabina often lamented that she didn't understand where they had made such a gap in her upbringing and why she behaved this way. "I don't understand, what kind of daughter is she? Everyone in our family is hardworking, my husband and I weren't always millionaires. We started as ordinary engineers and earned all our money through hard work." Ida didn't appeal to Diana's taste. Perhaps jealousy and incomprehension played a role in it why her mother spent her time and money on some market trading. She would try to sting the girl every now and then, hinting at her previous job, her inability to dress fashionably, or her poverty. But her favorite topic, of course, was Rosa. Or rather, the fact that Ida was raising her alone, without a father. The thing was, Diana herself had had a fiancé for several years. And she seemed very proud of this fact. "Strange girls, who choose someone and then wonder why they were dumped," she would say, as if talking to a friend on the phone, but intentionally loud enough for Ida to hear. "My Roberto is not like that. I would never choose a guy who would get you pregnant and then leave you. Roberto caused as much trouble as his fiancée did." Ignoring Diana's mocking remarks was not a difficult task for Ida. She had heard plenty of negativity directed at her at work. She simply continued to work calmly and ignored it all. However, Roberto would throw ambiguous looks her way, and when Diana wasn't around, he would make some rather unpleasant compliments. In short, he behaved like a typical womanizer. Undoubtedly, as the daughter of the homeowners, she could have noticed these signs if she hadn't been so preoccupied with self-admiration. She had no doubt that she was absolutely irresistible and that her fiancé was head over heels in love with her. Ida, on the other hand, understood perfectly well that if Roberto was in love, it was solely with her parents' money. It was for the sake of that money that he was dating the naive Diana. He would be happy to find another attractive girl to attach himself to. It was unknown how much longer this story would have continued and how it would have ended if a significant sum of money had not gone missing from the homeowner's safe one day. Anyone could have taken it, considering Sabina and Antonio were absolute extroverts and their home always had many guests. Diana, of course, had her own version of the money's disappearance. "You ungrateful snake." She attacked Ida as soon as Sabina gathered everyone for a family meeting and informed them of the situation. "My parents practically brought you back from the dead, and this is how you repay them? As if they don't pay you enough for your insignificant job. Or maybe it was your daughter who took it. She has already shown herself to be a thief." "Diana, stop." Her mother interrupted sharply. I don't believe Ida could have stolen that money. Then who else? The girl persisted. Do you think I did it? I didn't say that. Who knows what could have happened? I think we should call the police. Let them investigate everything. But before that, if any of you needed that money, no matter the reason, I suggest confessing now, and we won't involve the police. Or return everything that was stolen by tomorrow, and we'll pretend it never happened. Yes, Diana chimed in immediately, resuming her taunting. Confess and get out of our house and back to your market. Although maybe prison would be better for you. Enough, Diana. Her mother interrupted again. I won't listen to baseless accusations. I've said what I wanted to say. I'm giving all of you time to think. Ida, even though she knew she was innocent, had a very restless night's sleep. She understood that if it came to involving the police, no one would bother investigating anything. The poor woman who had been taken in as a maid out of pity stole money from the trusting homeowners. It was the simplest explanation, and no proof was needed. On the other hand, she felt a subtle change in how she was treated. The homeowners, although they remained impeccably polite, displayed a certain coldness toward her. Sabina had said she didn't believe Ida could be a thief, but it was clear that even she had her doubts. And if the money magically appeared in the safe tomorrow, undoubtedly everyone would think she was responsible. Whichever way she looked at it, the situation seemed hopeless. Perhaps Diana had taken her parents' money without asking to frame her. After all, Ida had no reason to steal. Her parents would have given her practically any sum of money without asking unnecessary questions. It was late, closer to 1 o'clock at night, when Rosa entered her room. The girl lived in the neighboring room and must have heard her mother tossing and turning in bed, unable to fall asleep. Perhaps she came to inquire about what had happened. Ida had already begun to think about what she would tell her. It was one thing for herself, but her daughter. How would she explain to Rosa why they were unexpectedly expelled from paradise? And the fact that they would have to leave their home seemed like an almost inevitable event to her. She did not yet know that her lovely daughter had come not with questions or comfort, but with a solution to her own problem. Mom, forgive me, please, the girl began with words that Ida never expected to hear. For what? She cautiously asked, fearing the worst deep down inside. I know it's not good to eavesdrop on other people's conversations, and that adults sometimes talk about things children shouldn't hear. But it just happened. I know what you were talking about in the kitchen today. And I also know who took the money you were talking about. And when I saw him doing it, I wondered if Senor and Senorita had allowed him. Just in case, I recorded it on my phone. Ida hugged her daughter tightly. How smart she was growing up. And diplomatic too. Not long ago, Rosa received a smartphone as a birthday gift from Sabina. There were no objections from the girl's mother. She didn't even consider it. She said, even for studying, they need phones nowadays, and you have enough other things to spend your money on. So let it be. And now, this smartphone came in handy at the most unexpected moment. The next day, of course, there was no money in the safe. Diana was unusually silent this time, but a malicious smile played on her lips. It seemed she was absolutely certain that the hated maid would disappear from her life forever. However, an extremely unpleasant surprise awaited her. Ida, although she was kind and gentle by nature, had to make an effort to suppress her own schadenfreude. After all, this girl had caused her many unpleasant experiences, but now she had a chance to bring her down. And maybe, finally, she would understand how wrong she had been behaving all this time. Well, what now? Sabina said sadly, opening the safe and confirming that the missing money had not magically reappeared. Looks like we'll have to call the police after all. Unless, of course, someone wants to tell me something right now. Wait, Ida began. She saw the triumph in Diana's eyes and how sad her mother's face became. I know who took the money, and I have evidence. Rosa saw the thief and recorded him on her phone. Placing her smartphone in a way that everyone could see the screen, she started recording. Although the angle wasn't ideal, it was still possible to clearly see who was taking the money from the safe and carefully closing it. It turned out to be Roberto, Diana's fiancé. Despite everything, the homeowners decided not to involve the police. After all, Roberto wasn't a complete stranger. They simply demanded that he return the money, threatening to involve the authorities if he didn't comply. Roberto was incredibly angry, both at Diana's parents and at Diana herself. He caused a disgraceful scene right in their house. He shouted about how they already had a lot of money and how they couldn't spare a small amount that he desperately needed. In the end, he added that he wanted nothing to do with such stingy people, including their daughter, of course. And he stormed off, slamming the door loudly. Contrary to Ida's hopes, this situation didn't diminish Diana in the slightest. On the contrary, she became even more unbearable. As soon as the door closed behind her now obvious ex-fiancé, she continued the scene with double the intensity. "So, some random girl can steal money from your card," she shouted at her mother, "but your own daughter's fiancé can't even borrow a small sum? Come on, it's just pocket change. You wouldn't even notice. Do you even know what your so-called fiancé needed the money for?" Her mother replied, "What does it matter?" "It does matter. We've never denied either you or him small expenses. But this time, it's a considerable amount. And if it was for a good cause, we would have given it, and he knew that. So, there's something about it that we wouldn't approve of," Antonio reasoned. "You never approve of anything if it's related to me." Diana continued to throw a tantrum. "You've ruined someone's life. Mine too." She stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door loudly. In the hallway, she bumped into Ida, who was dusting the hangers, trying to ignore the escalating argument in the kitchen. It wasn't easy, as Diana was shouting so loudly that the whole house could hear. Ida could only be glad that her daughter was at school and didn't hear all this horror. "You!" Diana shifted her focus to Ida as soon as she noticed her. "It's all because of you. Ever since you appeared in this house, I knew it wouldn't end well. What a clever girl you are, recording a video on your phone to catch the thief. And I believed it. Roberto and I love each other, and you just couldn't stand that you couldn't keep your man and decided to sow discord between us." "Diana," Ida tried to reason with her, "can't you see? This Roberto only loved your money. Once he realized he couldn't put his hands in your parents' pockets anymore, he ran away immediately. Don't you dare speak ill of him like that. Don't you even dare utter his name. How dare you still have the audacity to talk to me?" The following days at home turned into a living hell for Ida, from which she diligently tried to protect her daughter. However, Rosa still heard the constant arguments that now flared up over the slightest provocation. The poor girl began to feel guilty for what she had done and for showing that recording. But she just wanted to save her mom. Diana didn't rush to leave the house, even though she repeatedly threatened that she would never set foot in it again. Instead, she created scenes that were disgraceful to both her parents and Ida. The only thing she had enough tact for was to avoid having explicit confrontations in the presence of the child. "We all just need to get through this," Sabina said one evening after another scandal. "Both her and all of us. She's devastated. It seems like she was really in love with that scoundrel, and now she's experiencing his betrayal. It will pass." She spoke confidently, but her voice trembled. Ida could see that even the head of the family would soon lose her composure. She felt very sorry for this beautiful woman, but she couldn't even imagine how she could help her. Moreover, she also felt guilty for everything that had been happening lately. But one day everything changed. It would have been nice if it happened because Diana finally realized everything and calmed down. However, the reason was completely different and unfortunately not joyful at all. The tragedy that occurred truly silenced the entire household, but now every resident wanted to return to the times when the dishes in the kitchen rang with the cries of the homeowner's daughter. Ida was sitting on her bed, reading, when Diana burst into the room. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to start another argument, but in the next moment, it became clear that something had happened. The girl's face was as pale as chalk, and tears were rolling down her cheeks. With difficulty, she managed to say, "Dad. Dad got into an accident. He's in the hospital. He needs a blood transfusion. Mom is asking if you would agree to come with us and donate blood. He has a rare blood type, so the more options, the better. Of course, the woman simply replied. Without going into details that she herself didn't know, she explained to Rosa that Antonio was seriously ill and needed help. Therefore, all the adults needed to leave for a while. So, you'll be in charge of the house. Behave yourself, she said. Of course, Mommy. They quickly gathered their things and headed to the hospital. Sabina wanted to drive herself, but they managed to convince her, through joint efforts, to wait for a driver. Her hands were shaking, and in that state, she definitely shouldn't be driving. An hour later, they were at the blood transfusion station. One by one, samples were taken from all of them for compatibility testing and various necessary analyses. Holding their breath, the three women waited for the results in the corridor, jumping each time a door opened. They all understood perfectly well that time was running out. Diana clutched Ida's hand tightly, behaving extremely restlessly, swaying her leg, sniffling, and at times quietly crying and moaning. If Dad dies, and the last thing I said to him was, "He won't die." Sabina cut her off, but her voice lacked the conviction she tried to portray. Ida did her best to calm the girl down, even though she herself was trembling. Despite the strained, to put it mildly, relationship between her and Diana, she felt sorry for the girl. Perhaps she was too spoiled by loving parents and had never before encountered real-life difficulties. Right now, both of them were going through a shared sorrow that brought them together. After all, for Ida, Antonio had become almost like a father figure she had never really had. Her biological father had never shown any interest in her life. In fact, all her parents cared about was the presence of alcohol in the house. In a way, Sabina and Antonio had replaced her mother and father, giving her the warmth she had so desperately lacked in her childhood. Finally, the door of the designated office opened, and a doctor emerged. His expression was extremely perplexed. It was impossible to tell what news he was carrying as he walked toward them. Nevertheless, all three of them hoped for the best, but they were clearly not prepared for what they were about to hear in the next few minutes. Frankly, now was not the most appropriate time to discuss this, but Diana, you are not our patient's relative. And neither are you, the last sentence was directed at Sabina. And unfortunately, your blood is not suitable for transfusion. All three of them tried to make sense of what was said, but it just didn't fit in their minds. It sounded like nonsense. What did it mean that Diana was not related to either Sabina or Antonio? How was that possible? It was shocking, but right now, it was somewhat overshadowed by the last statement about the blood not being suitable. Meanwhile, the doctor allowed them a moment to process the information and continued. However, your blood, Ida Vargas, is a perfect match. And even without a detailed analysis, I can tell that you are a fairly close relative of our patient. There was no time for speculation, and Ida went to donate blood for Antonio. Just an hour later, the complex operation began, intended to save his life. There was a collective sigh of relief. Of course, there was always a risk that something could go wrong, especially considering the severity of the patient's condition. Nevertheless, the best doctors who could be found in such a short time were fighting for Antonio's life. Additionally, one of the most challenging aspects was finding suitable blood for him. The operation lasted for several hours but was ultimately successful. Antonio remained in a stable but critical condition, with the main threats to his life eliminated. Now, all they could do was entrust him to the care of the doctors and wait for him to regain consciousness and be able to speak with his family and loved ones. Meanwhile, Sabina couldn't shake off the doctor's words. She convinced both girls to take a DNA test. It confirmed what the doctor at the donor center had told them. Ida turned out to be a blood relative, most likely her daughter. However, Diana had no connection to either of them. To unravel this mystery, Sabina sought the help of private detectives. They conducted an investigation that turned out to be quite straightforward. The town was small, with a low population growth rate. Not many births occurred, and they were relatively infrequent. As a result, only 2 women gave birth in one of the 3 maternity hospitals on the specified date. Sabina was one of them. At that time, when Sabina's family was not yet affluent, they couldn't afford a private room, so she stayed in a shared one. They were pleased that only one person was sharing the room with her, almost like VIP service without extra charges. Sabina remembered that time well and her roommate in the hospital. The woman wasn't particularly talkative, rather, she constantly muttered and complained about life. Initiating a conversation with her would have been difficult. However, she didn't cause any trouble, and thus, no one paid much attention to her. In contrast to Sabina, who regularly received visits from her husband, parents, and friends, no one came to the other expectant mother. Clearly, she came from an unfortunate family and seemed destined to continue her marginalized lifestyle even after giving birth. It was a pity for this person who, even before coming into the world, found herself unwanted by anyone. However, there was nothing that could be done about it. Both women gave birth within a day of each other, and both had girls. Both infants were healthy and strong, bringing joy to their mothers. All 4 of them had to spend a few more days in the hospital after being discharged. Sabina, who had a difficult delivery, barely remembered the subsequent events. This explained why she didn't notice the substitution. It was carried out by one of the midwives. The hospital administration found out about it quite quickly, but it was already after both mothers had been discharged. In typical fashion for government institutions, especially in small provincial towns, it was decided not to make a big fuss about the matter. Since it was impossible to discreetly correct the situation at that point, they left everything as it was. They only fired the midwife, who soon found herself under lifelong psychiatric care. The baby substitution was likely the reason for her placement there. However, no one bothered to investigate further why she behaved in such a manner. Nevertheless, the detectives managed to uncover the motives behind her actions. Apart from her mental disorder, it turned out to be sheer envy. She had decided that if she was going through misery, then no one in this world should be happy. Especially a perfectly well-off woman who, moreover, was able to conceive and give birth to a child. And that woman happened to be Sabina, by chance. The midwife herself also wanted to have children very much, but all her attempts ended in failure. At first, she struggled to conceive for a long time, and when it finally happened, it turned out that she was physically unable to carry a child. As a result, she had a miscarriage at an early stage. Since then, she harbored resentment towards all women who, unlike her, could have children. However, she didn't quit her job because she had nowhere else to go. Slowly, year after year, she began to lose her mind while witnessing happy mothers whom she herself had helped deliver. Of course, no one noticed. And then, at the moment when Sabina was giving birth, something in the mind of this unfortunate woman finally snapped. Perhaps the reason was that this mother-to-be had everything that the midwife didn't: a loving husband, caring friends and parents, a well-paying job, and wonderful prospects. And now, on top of it all, a child. The midwife decided that she needed to slightly ruin this perfect life and swap the baby with a marginal person whom she coincidentally gave birth to almost simultaneously. It's understandable that whether you want it or not, genetics will make itself known. It won't be easy for this woman to raise someone else's child, especially one like that. As fate would have it, Sabina and Antonio's biological daughter ended up in the hands of alcoholic parents who never gave her the attention she deserved. Meanwhile, Diana lucked out and ended up in a family that was destined to become very wealthy in the near future. And they were living quite well at the time as well. But, as the midwife had anticipated, the girl's character was influenced not only by her upbringing but also by genetic traits. That's why she behaved the way she did. Moreover, she believed that all her parents' money and everything they had achieved belonged to her by birthright. And what now? Diana asked, after listening to this story. Well, what now? Sabina exclaimed in surprise. Well, it turns out I'm not your biological daughter and, in general, I don't have the right to be here. "Don't talk nonsense," her mother replied. "I fed, raised, nurtured, and loved you all these years, of course. How could I not love you? Who knows who might have switched babies and who your biological parents are, you, my daughter. If, of course, you're willing to consider me your mother now. Of course, Mommy, I love you too." Tears welled up in Diana's eyes, and she rushed to hug Sabina. Ida observed this scene with a sense of awkwardness, not knowing what to do now. It turns out her real parents were this wealthy couple who had done so much for her and her daughter. But they hadn't raised her, hadn't heard her first word, hadn't witnessed her first steps. It wasn't to them that she brought home her first top grade from school or her first reprimand. Although the people who had raised her hadn't paid attention to either of those things. Yet, despite everything, she loved them, the ones she considered her parents. There were good moments too. After all, they had still raised her and hadn't starved her. They clothed and shod her, never hit her or anything like that. Yes, her childhood couldn't be called particularly happy, but it wasn't utterly terrible either. Her parents, though they drank most of the time, were never violent. Even when they ran out of alcohol, they usually just fell asleep to go get a new bottle the next morning. Occasionally, one of them would find some odd job, so the family didn't have to go hungry. It wasn't exactly a well-fed life either, but it wasn't always the worst. Ida found memories from her very early childhood in her mind when her mother was still sober. Her father was already drinking back then, but hadn't completely dragged his wife down to the bottom yet. And she diligently took care of the baby, whom she clearly loved in her own way. Ida remembered how her mother rejoiced at her first steps and how she read her bedtime stories when she herself was slightly younger than Rosa is now. And how she could go to her mother with any sorrow and receive support. And how proud and satisfied she was with even the smallest and most insignificant achievements of her daughter. Gradually, she stopped caring. She was dressed, had shoes on, or had eaten. Every day she would come home, well, whatever, everything was fine. Her daughter's stories no longer touched her motherly heart. All that interested this woman now was the presence or absence of the coveted bottle. Perhaps things would have turned out differently if she had found the strength to her husband. But for some reason, she continued to hold on to him. Whether out of habit or out of fear that she wouldn't survive on her own. Although it seemed like the father had no involvement in the family's life, she could have been unaware of that. Ida tried to study diligently and rebel. Several times she even ran away from home for a long time. But no one looked for her, no one cared. This story ended quite predictably. Her parents drank themselves to death. And one day, when she came home, she found them lifeless. It happened to be her 18th birthday that day. Did she feel anything? Strangely enough, yes. Despite everything, she grieved deeply for her mother and father and was grateful to them for managing to raise her to adulthood in some way. She knew that deep down in their hearts, they loved her. At least, it applied to her mother. As for Sabina, she was essentially a stranger, someone whose fate she had become involved in out of pity and kindness. Ida was grateful to this woman, felt a warm attachment to her. But she didn't feel any certainty that these feelings were mutual. "I have enough room in my heart for both daughters," the woman said, as if reading her thoughts. "Actually, I always thought it would be nice if Diana had a little sister or brother. But the first childbirth was very difficult, so I never dared to go through it again." She hugged Ida tightly. A few seconds later, Ida felt Diana joining in the embrace. It looked like a truly miraculous reunion of a long-lost family. There was only one person missing to make this picture complete. Antonio was discharged from the hospital only several months later, even though improvements had occurred much earlier. Until that moment, they all visited him as a family, including little Rosa. As expected, the man was very surprised by the story of the baby switch. But like Sabina, he was happy to have two daughters now. Diana apologized for her abhorrent behavior to her parents and to Ida, whom she now referred to as nothing less than a sister. Of course, it wasn't just the fact that she turned out to be their non-biological daughter that influenced her. The accident that nearly took her father's life also had a strong impact, forcing her to reconsider certain things. And the support that Ida had provided her during that difficult time convinced the girl that she had been unfair to her. The shared grief brought them together, helping them understand each other and develop a certain mutual sympathy. And then they discovered that they were connected more closely than they could have ever imagined. As for little Rosa, she appeared completely unsurprised when they gently told her, omitting unnecessary details about the situation. Such stories were still part of her young mind's understanding of the world. So, the girl simply rejoiced in having a grandma and grandpa. Over time, she also grew accustomed to her aunt, although it wasn't easy considering Diana's past behavior. But she did her best to make amends to her parents, Ida, and her daughter. By the time Antonio made a full recovery, their extended family had come together and lived quite harmoniously in the same grand mansion. Sometime after his return, the father gathered all the adults for a family meeting. He chose a time when Rosa was at school, ensuring that she wouldn't overhear anything unnecessary. The reason for the meeting was serious, and it was unlikely that the child needed to know anything about it. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "ever since I regained consciousness and was able to somewhat piece together the facts. Then you told me about how Ida and Diana were switched at the maternity ward, which understandably pushed everything else out of my mind for a while. But then the thoughts came back, and I must inform you that the accident I was involved in wasn't a mere coincidence." A tense silence hung in the air as everyone tried to comprehend the meaning of Antonio's words. And it seemed that they all arrived at a similar conclusion. In his characteristic soft manner, the father had just informed them that someone had tried to kill him. The revelation shocked and frightened them all. No one dared to say anything. They were all waiting for the continuation of his speech, and soon it came. "I believe someone tampered with my brakes, but besides that, it's possible that someone forced me off the road into that very ravine where my car crashed. I can't be certain because I remember the moment of the fall very poorly. I only remember that the brakes didn't work when they should have. I had recently passed a routine inspection, and everything was in order. But if that's the case, it means that someone who knew when and where I would be traveling did it. But who could wish you harm?" Diana exclaimed in horror. "Well, for example, you," Antonio chuckled, using his tone to indicate that it was just a joke. "But seriously, I don't know. And that's what bothers me the most. Someone could have targeted not just me personally, but our entire family. And in that case, all of you are in danger. That's why I gathered you all here. I want you to be extra cautious until the culprit is found. And today, I will file a report with the police and let them investigate." And so they did. The report was filed, and the police began their work. Knowing that they were dealing with a person of influence in the town, they made sure to conduct the investigation with utmost care. They started with inspecting the car, which confirmed Antonio's concerns. The brakes were indeed tampered with. Additionally, some dents on the body couldn't have been caused by the fall into the ravine. Therefore, his vague memory of the car being pushed was validated. Someone wanted to ensure that their plan worked flawlessly, and Antonio wouldn't survive the car accident. As soon as the family was informed of this discovery, armed security was hired for each of them. This included Rosa, to whom they explained that these two aunts, and Ida insisted that her daughter be protected by women to make her more comfortable, would accompany her temporarily to and from school. Going anywhere else was forbidden for now. The intelligent young girl didn't argue, understanding that such restrictions wouldn't be put in place without reason. All vehicles were thoroughly checked by the guards before each trip. Fortunately, nothing else suspicious was found. But no one thought of letting their guard down. It was possible that it was just a precautionary measure, and after the failed attempt, the perpetrator backed off from their plans. Or maybe they had a personal vendetta against Antonio and not the entire family. But it never hurts to be cautious. Meanwhile, the investigation continued in full swing. All family members were thoroughly questioned, but no one could recall anything suspicious on that day. Everything was as usual. Nobody could imagine who Antonio could have bothered to the extent that someone wanted to kill him. Their joint business with his wife was conducted honestly, without crossing anyone's path. They earned a considerable amount by the town standards, but not enough for someone to want to take their company or anything of that sort. I apologize for the misunderstanding. Here's the revised translation with dashes used to denote direct speech. By all means, the initial version of the investigation suggesting that the assassination attempt was somehow connected to the business was deemed inconclusive. They then began developing the idea that it could be a personal vendetta. And that's when the first and only suspect emerged. A serious conflict, which had been happening in this family recently, involved Diana's ex-fiancé. Only he had some reasons to seek revenge. Granted, it was quite difficult to believe that he would try to kill Antonio simply because he was prevented from stealing money. Of course, even Diana had realized by then that Roberto was, to put it mildly, an unreliable person. But there's a difference between a swindler or even a thief and a murderer. Moreover, there were no threats from him to the family. He simply left, slamming the door. And no one heard anything about him afterward. For a while, Diana tried to reach out to her former fiancé, but he simply didn't answer her calls. In essence, none of them knew anything about Roberto. Did he work somewhere or study? Who did he associate with? What did he do in his free time? Who were his parents? The police had to find out all of that. And after some time, they discovered that he did indeed have a motive to wish for Antonio's death. "We have found out," said the investigator, summoning them, "that this person did indeed carry out the assassination attempt on you. However, you can dismiss the security detail. He won't bother you anymore." "Why are you so sure about that?" Antonio inquired. "Because he is dead. We didn't have to search for long. His body was found in his own house." As it turned out, Roberto was involved in some major financial manipulations and also enjoyed gambling. He had been lucky for a while. But at some point, luck turned away from him, and he discovered that he had a substantial amount of money owed to serious criminal authorities. They had no intention of waiting for him to marry Diana and acquire the money in a more or less official manner. That's why he decided to steal, hoping that no one would investigate the matter and everything would be blamed on the recently appeared maid in the house. But the plan didn't work, and he had no other way to obtain a large sum of money. Roberto realized that it was all over. Those people he had gotten involved with would surely come after him and take either the money or his life. So he decided that if he was going to die, he wouldn't do it alone and attempted to take the one he considered responsible for his misfortunes with him. "Thank you," the investigator remarked, concluding his narrative. "Thanks to your attentiveness and dedication, we have managed to expose the gang we have been pursuing for several years. Soon, all of them will find themselves behind bars, where they belong." After weeks of tension, the family finally managed to breathe a sigh of relief. The security guards were released. Rosa was allowed to go out and meet her school friends again. Numerous guests started visiting the house again, and everyone was happy to see them. Thanks to Rosa's strong desire, after several months of debates, persuasions, and negotiations, the family decided to get a dog. True to her promise, the girl takes care of the puppy herself, walking, feeding, and grooming it. At this stage of her life, she is doing well in school and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Ida and Diana eventually became great friends and spent a lot of free time together. Diana got her act together and enrolled in college, realizing that it's never too late to pursue a good profession. Sabina and Antonio hoped that their daughters would help them with the business and eventually take over the management of the company.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.